Thanks, Francis, and thanks everyone for coming out on the return of winter today, I guess. I thought it was spring, but it's not. Winter's back. And I have to admit, I like that. I walked out of the house today, and that smell, that crisp, cold snow smell, I still like it, even though we're 4 months in. It's still good. Okay, so today, I'm going to talk to you today about land reclamation, and the idea is going to be trying to link disturbance with ecosystem function and ecosystem processes. And so I'd just like to start off with an acknowledgement slides. Of course, this is collaborative work. Research doesn't get done just as an individual. It gets done by a team of people, and I've been fortunate over the last 10 or 15 years to work with a number of different people who are really highly qualified and inspirational people, including Sylvie Quito, who's here, Simon in the department, who's away right now, Marty Yarmich and Clara Quiliza and Rob Vassoff are some industrial partners. And then in my PhD work, Tom DeLuca, Bill Holben, and Pat Ball. I'm going to show some data that I collaborated on with them. I've had the privilege of supervising a number of really good graduate students over the last little while. I sort of mentored Roxanne a little bit, and Jess Leatherdale, and then co-supervised Preston and Sorensen and Tyrell Hemsley with Sylvie. And I have some new students, Sanatan Arzu, Jill Martin, Mark Howell in the room today. And then lab techs as well, right? So undergraduate lab techs sort of drive research, and I've had a number of different lab techs that have been great, both at the University of Alberta and the University of Montana. And then just some different funding partners, NSERC Discovery and CRD, Conrad, Oil Sands Network for Research and Development, Syncrude Canada, the Canadian Foundation for Innovation has funded infrastructure in my lab, which has been terrific. And then when I was in Montana, it was the National Science Foundation McIntyre Stennis program. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about disturbance. So the first thing I wanted to touch on was disturbance. And so we can think of different kinds of disturbance that initiate different kinds of ecosystem processes. And there's basically, we can categorize these into two broad categories sort of based on the magnitude of disturbance. And so we have these ones, these fairly high magnitude, severe disturbances that initiate what we might call primary ecosystem development, such as glacial retreat or continental shelf uplift and sand beach dunes or floodplains or volcanic eruptions. And all of these disturbances, what they have in common is that they redistribute geologic material and basically reinitiate soil pedogenic processes from almost a time zero. And as these different substrates are colonized by plants, transformations in soil horizonation happens, organic matter accumulation happens, and there are some plant community dynamics that go along with that, as well as microbial community dynamics. Okay, and we can sort of compare those to disturbances that are maybe of a lower magnitude in severity or intensity, and that don't reinitiate soil development, primary soil development. So soils are generally left intact on these disturbance regimes, such as this is an example of wildfire in the subalpine, lodgepole pine ecosystems around Hinton. Or we can also think of ice storm events in eastern Canada and northeastern North America in the mixed deciduous forests. So ice storms or wind throw, hurricanes, wind throw damage. Okay, so these kinds of disturbance kill the above ground vegetation and so therefore alter plant community dynamics, but they don't reinitiate soil development. So soils remain more or less intact, but they certainly alter soil processes. And we'll look at some of those in a little while. And they alter microbial community dynamics as well. So basically, I believe that we can compare these natural disturbances to man-made disturbances. And I think that we have surrogates, or not surrogates, but we have equivalent types of disturbance in terms of magnitude. And so as far as glacial retreat goes, surface mining is what I would argue is a similar magnitude to glacial retreat in terms of we need to recreate primary soil development and plant community dynamics. Or if we're looking at something, forest fire harvesting has a similar magnitude as fire. We have a similar removal of vegetation, but lower or less effect on soil properties. What we don't have here is going to be this sort of heat pulse and charcoal production, which I'll talk about in a little while, which I think is really important. But we could argue that what we can learn from this sort of primary ecosystem development and secondary ecosystem development, we should be applying to ecosystem recovery from anthropogenic disturbances. Okay, so basically, if we look at these, let's say forest fire is the example that I'm going to use predominantly today, and that's because most of our Western Canadian ecosystems experience fire as the predominant natural disturbance regime. And we can look at those natural processes, we can sort of examine different ecosystem processes and different key variables, okay? And so some of those key variables that I look at are things like nutrient availability, plant growth or productivity of the site, net ecosystem productivity. We can also, and community dynamics too, or how do those plant communities change over time? As well as sort of microbial ecology, what kind of species are present, what kind of functions or what kind of processes are they carrying out, and how do those community dynamics change with time since fire, and sort of organic matter quality that changes with time since fire too. And so I think what we should be doing is, or what I've been trying to do in my research program, is take what we learn from these natural ecosystem processes and then apply them to this managed environment, either in terms of harvesting and forestry or in land reclamation. Okay, so that's sort of my introduction on disturbance, ecosystem processes and disturbance. And now what I thought I would do is spend just a few minutes sort of refreshing you guys about oil sands in the province, okay? So Alberta's oil sand deposits, there's an estimated 1.7 trillion barrels of bitumen, which is the largest or second largest, I've also heard, petroleum reserve in the world. You can see that there's 4 main deposits in the province, and the Athabasca deposit is the largest of those 4. And you can see here that this is the current development just north of Fort McMurray, the current different oil sands producers. There's an estimated 1.75 billion barrels recoverable by surface mining, and another estimated 315 billion barrels with technological advances, such as SAGD. Okay, so it's quite a large oil reserve, and you can see it's a significant proportion of Alberta's boreal forest, which comes in at about 380,000 kilometers squared, and oil sand deposits roughly about just under half of that. Okay, so it's quite a large area. It could have a very significant impact on boreal forest ecosystems. If we look at the geology, just quickly, oil sands can appear near the surface of the banks of the Athabasca River. And just as a historical note, sort of interesting, Sir Alexander Mackenzie wrote about it in his journal and his travels as far back as 1788. Wrote about sort of these tar developments at the surface and coming out of the banks of the Athabasca River. But most of the surface or mining available oil sands is buried under about 40 or 50 meters of muskeg and or geologic overburden. And so you can just see from this image here that all of the vegetation has to be removed and all of the surface soils, as well as about 40 meters of overburdened geologic material, has to be removed from this environment. So it's a pretty significant disturbance, and as I would argue, again, similar in magnitude to glacial advance and retreat. When we look at land reclamation, so land reclamation is mandated by the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act of the Government of Alberta, and Part 5, Section 121 says that an operator must conserve and reclaim specified lands and eventually obtain a reclamation certificate related to sustainability of the reclaimed ecosystem. Okay, so that's the mandate, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But it's challenging. There's 3 different sort of areas that make land reclamation in the oil sands challenging. The first one is that it's an extremely large footprint. Okay, so this is the Mildred Lake mine of Syncrude, Canada. So this is just one of 7 producers, one of 7 oil sands producers. just north of Fort McMurray. And this picture is already probably about 10 years old. And so this outline area here that was going to be developed is now fully developed. Okay, so this entire disturbance area is basically what you can see in the picture here. And so what's interesting is that typical metal mines are only about 500 to 800 hectares and represent this small square area down there, right? So there's no precedent for the scale of reclamation here, okay? This overall area just of Syncrude, just one of 7 producers, is probably in the area of 4,000 or 5,000 hectares already. So lack of precedence at this scale. Then there's 10 to 20 distinct landforms in there that we need to reclaim. Wetlands, upland forest, riparian areas, distinct landforms with sort of multiple watersheds with complex interactions. So it's the scale and the diversity of ecosystems is a challenge for sure. The second challenge is that there's a number of different kinds of materials we can call difficult, in quotations, difficult materials. And these are some of the waste products or overburden materials that come from oil sands upgrading. And so one of them is erodible substrates. We have coarse texture materials that can erode very easily. We have saline sodic overburden material. So immediately that stuff can't be used in reclamation because it would fail reclamation certification because of saline sodicity levels too high for plant growth, too high for microorganisms. And then we have other byproducts, sulfur, soft tailings. So this is high salt concentration in the water here, fine textured materials that basically remains deflocculated indefinitely. Hard to dewater this material. And then petroleum coke is another one that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later. And this is a byproduct of oil sands upgrading. And then the third challenge is that there's high expectations. Sort of at the public level, there's very high expectations for how to recover these different ecosystems, all right? So as I said, there's multiple different landforms. So we're using an ecosystem-based approach. We want to recreate sort of target ecosystems that are native to the area. And we'll see, though, that the percentages of different ecosystems is changing to some degree up there. But there's uncertainties in terms of we're using an ecosystem-based approach, but it's hard to track the recovery of long-lived species, right? So I have a research career of 25, 30 years, but my forest, my target ecosystem isn't mature for 100 years, 150 years. So difficult to track the trajectory of development, and we'll sort of talk about how we might do that. And they have to be entirely self-sustaining. And yet we don't currently have no data on whether or not our reclaimed sites can be self-sustaining. And self-sustaining means that in the face of disturbance, would they regenerate themselves, as well as supporting, suitable habitat and suitable ecosystem processes and functions in order that they can regenerate after fire or after disturbance. And then there's some competing land use, and then the last one sort of put those two together. Ever-increasing expectations. So you see this image here is like, this is Mildred Lake, End Pit Lake, and you have a cottage there. They're going really cheap right now, but they might get more expensive in the future, right? It's high expectations. Are we going to really have a recreational environment up there? I don't know. We'll see. Okay, so we can talk about plant community dynamics. And what we know about from natural ecosystems is that plant communities shift over time after disturbance. And so what we'd like to be able to do in the oil sands is sort of track the development of this sort of ecosystem-based approach, track the development over time, with the idea that before disturbance we have this sort of surface mining environment, which is almost like glacial materials. But how can we sort of increase the speed of development, right? We don't necessarily want to wait 10,000 years for soils to develop, so we go in and we build soil profiles. And we use clean capping materials in order to build soil profiles that vegetation, so that will establish and support healthy vegetation. And so we build these capping soils, and then we plant vegetation on them, and after 5 or 10 years, we have a plant community that's established on this site. And the question is, and we have data out to about 30 years since reclamation, but we don't have any data sort of in this, what happens, in another 50 to 100 years. Are these sites going to move to our target ecosystems, either, our aspen spruce ecotypes on fine texture materials or our pine lichen ecosystem types on coarse textured materials? And we have no idea. Well, that's what we're trying to answer. Those are some of the questions we're trying to answer right now. So the mandate here, again, as I've mentioned before, the mandate is to return these to equivalent land capability. And what that is generally being measured by productivity on site. Are these sites as productive as they can be in order to establish that land capability? But it's important to remember that in the footprint of the oil sands region north of Fort McMurray, the native ecosystems are about 70% wetland, 30% upland forest. And in the post-reclamation environments, those numbers are going to flip. They're probably going to be more like 70% upland and 30% wetland. And so one argument is that meeting equivalent land capability is going to be quite easy because we're basically generating or we're building upland forest ecosystems which are far more productive than wetland ecosystems. But the problem with that is that we're using peatlands to build forest soils. And so what we'll see is that one of the major clean reclamation substrates is peat, and which forms in an anaerobic environment and has anaerobic plant propagules and anaerobic microorganism community. And we're putting that into an upland forest position, which is an aerobic environment. And what we'll see, I'll show you some evidence in a bit that suggests that doesn't work very well with decomposition kinetics and nutrient availability. So that's potentially a problem. Okay, and so as I mentioned before, we're creating anthrosols. And so in trying to, during the reclamation practice, we are building these clean surface soil materials. Okay, so if this is a basic profile for a natural soil, okay, so we have some amount of forest floor organics on the surface. We have an A horizon, a B horizon, and a C horizon. In the reclaimed environment, what we're doing is we are rebuilding this top meter of surface soils with clean materials to support plants. And one of the main practices in the oil sands has been to use a peat mineral mix in the top 20 centimeters. Okay, so this is selectively salvaged pre-disturbance materials that's dominated by peat. And so they say a peat mineral mixture is supposed to have a mixture, it's supposed to have some mineral material in it. But in a lot of cases, the peat is found on a very fine textured clay soil that doesn't mix very well. So in many cases, the peat mineral mix is actually almost straight peat in the surface 20 centimeters. So what we're trying to do here is sort of recreate some horizonation and recreate a nutrient-rich zone in the surface soils. The other surface, or the other selectively salvaged substrate material that's used commonly in soils reclamation is a forest floor mineral mixture. And that's selectively salvaged from upland forest environments, okay? So pine and aspen stands, the forest floor, after harvesting, the forest floor is scraped off of those stands with probably most of the AE horizon underneath. And that material is then used for capping studies as well. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that this material is a better substrate for plant growth for a number of different reasons. I'll show you some data to show that it has maybe better decomposition kinetics, but it's also been shown by researchers in our department, Dean Mackenzie and Ann Nath, have shown that it's a better source of native plant propagules as well if it's used right away. So if this is sort of direct placement, so picked up from one site and put down in the reclamation environment right away, it has native plant propagules and seeds, so it generates a more diverse plant community than peat mineral mix does. The problem with it is that it has to be used right away, and there's not enough of it. As I said, there's only maybe 30% upland forest and 70% peatland. So we have way more peat available for reclamation in the future. And so another question could be, well, what if we use a mixture of these two substrates? Okay, so we're going to jump into some data right away. What happens when we heavily disturb these ecosystems and then we rebuild soil profiles? What happens in terms of nutrient availability as one of our key ecosystem processes affected by disturbance? And so specifically here, we're looking at nitrification. We have gross ammonification, we're looking at gross nitrogen mineralization. We have gross ammonification here and gross nitrification on the bottom. And our four different treatments are, this is forest floor material over secondary substrate. This is forest floor peat mineral mixed. This is peat mineral by itself. And this is our natural forest floor substrate, okay? And what we can see is that disturbance causes an increase in nitrification rates, okay? And if we look at, on this panel here, this graph is the relative nitrification index. And so it's relative, so it's nitrification relative to the amount of ammonification. And so what we can see here, and then we have basically our same treatments. This is forest floor over secondary forest floor over peat mineral, so a mixture, peat mineral by itself, and then our natural forest floor. And then a couple of different sampling periods in the field. So there's some seasonal variability here, but we can see that all of our heavily disturbed or reclaimed soils have much higher nitrogen availability than our natural undisturbed soil. Okay? And that's not unexpected. And there's a lot of evidence in the literature that suggests that in naturally disturbed ecosystems do the same thing. They produce a lot of available nitrogen post-disturbance. So what I wanted to do, so disturbance affects ecosystem processes, specifically nitrogen availability. So what I've been doing in my lab is trying to, but this is sort of, if we just go back, this is comparing this to a mature target ecosystem, right? So this is essentially comparing babies to the elderly in a way, right? This is comparing five-year-old reclaimed sites to 100-year-old, mature forest ecosystems. Well, of course they're different. Why wouldn't we expect that in many ways, right? So one of the things that I set out to do in my sort of research program looking at reclaimed landscapes in Alberta is to compare these reclamation substrates or reclamation sites to a chrono sequence of fire sites. And this is some of the work, just as preliminary data that I'm going to show you from Jill Martin's work. So she's just wrapping this up, but it fits really nicely into what we're trying to do here. So we went out and we established a chrono sequence of time since fire in aspen and spruce stands in the oil sands region. And so Jill has sites that are anywhere from 2 years since fire to 131 years since fire. And she paired those with reclaimed sites going from 4 years since reclamation to about 27 years since reclamation, which is about the oldest reclaimed site that we have. And what she found was that if we just look at the natural fire chrono sequence data, what this graph is showing is on the x-axis we have years since disturbance or time since fire, and nitrate availability. So this is resin available nitrate. So we use resins, and we incubated these from August to the following May. And so we have sort of late season availability and then early snow melt to capture that early flush of nutrients. And what we find that there is a minor spike in nitrate. This site is obviously quite high, and so we would sort of assume from this data that fire causes a spike that sort of then rapidly returns to post-disturbance levels of nitrogen. Okay, so there's that increase in nitrate again that we see in natural fire ecosystems. Jill took this work a little further, and she looked at potentially mineralizable nitrogen, which is an anaerobic laboratory incubation that's just meant to look at what is the decomposability of organic matter in sort of under laboratory conditions or ideal conditions, 25 degrees and ideal moisture content. And what she found was that so we have natural forest floor material in green, and again, time since fire on the x-axis, natural forest floor material in green, and then we have reclaimed forest floor. So this is naturally developed on site. Okay, so when I say forest floor, I mean that's a natural layer that's developed in situ. And when I say forest floor mineral mix, that's a reclamation substrate. So we need to keep that a little bit straight. Okay, it's a bit confusing. So I'll say either, yeah. So this is natural LFH or reclaimed LFH versus reclaimed peat mineral mix. And what we see is that the natural site, in terms of potential mineralizable nitrogen, is higher and sort of increases with increasing time since fire. That's also been found in the literature. And what's interesting to note is that the reclaimed site falls kind of in the middle, with the soil, the peat mineral mix having very low mineralizable nitrogen availability, but the forest floor developing on that, or the natural litter layer developing, has slightly higher. Okay, sort of in between the peat substrate and the natural sites. So that might be some evidence for recovery or a trajectory towards ecosystem recovery. Jill also looked at the microbial community on these sites, and she did that with phospholipid fatty acid analysis, which just is basically a fingerprint for the microbial community, given that different microorganisms have slightly different arrangement of phospholipids in their cellular membrane. And then she plotted this as a multivariate data set that she plotted in ordination space. And so this is a non-metric multidimensional scaling. And so the key thing to remember is that each point is sort of summarized the multivariate data set, and it's reduced about 50 or 60 points into one number. And so that points that are close together in ordination space are more similar than points far apart. Okay? And then she has so she has her unburned sites are in green, her burned sites are in red, and her reclaimed sites are in blue. I don't know, the blue is probably a little hard to see here. But basically what this is suggesting is that with ecosystem recovery since fire, the burn sites have a very narrow diversity of microbial community types, okay? Whereas fire causes a shift in microbial community dynamics and causes them to spread out a little bit, and as does reclamation. But so what's interesting from this graph, or the take-home message, is that this reclamation profiles are for the most part quite different from our fire profiles. Although some of these points in here, because this point is close to this point, it means it's more similar to this fire site than it is to this other reclaimed site. And so that might suggest some recovery of ecosystem processes with reclamation as well. It's hard to say if those are the old reclaimed sites or not. Each one of these points represents an individual site. And so I don't think they are, because I believe that Jill would have had that in the graph. But this needs some further work. The other thing that I can show you just with ordination is just the vegetative or the plant community dynamics. And so this is understory vegetation. So it's aspen, spruce, overstory community. And this is understory vegetation at the genus level. So same thing, ordination space. And what we see is that the unburned site for vegetation is over here. The burn over site, again, you have a slightly more diverse type or community of plants in the burn over sites. And then a difference in the reclamation sites as well over here. And so again, though, you could argue that because there's some overlap with the unburn and the reclamation, that suggests that there's a similar kind of recovery to disturbance in the reclaimed environment. But without knowing what age sites these are, it's hard to say. And the rest of these sites are quite different from the burn over area, possibly suggesting they're on a different recovery, right? And so I think what I would argue from this, knowing sort of, I'm not going to show you guys the genuses of these different species, but the reclaimed sites tend to be more weedy species. Okay, so I'm going to change gears a little bit here, but I'm going to continue talking about wildfire and the natural, or wildfire, and we're going to sort of talk about one of the key residues of wildfire, which is charcoal. And I'm going to talk to you guys about the idea of charcoal as a substrate legacy. And so kind of like a biological legacy. And so what I glossed over in the introduction was that in our secondary, and disturbances that initiate secondary ecosystem development have a lot of biological legacies. Like a wildfire environment has a lot of root propagules, seed propagules, and a microbial community that's still intact. Those are biological legacies. Whereas in a glacial retreat, in a glacial till environment, there aren't any biological legacies. So what we might argue is that charcoal is this residue. It's this long-term residue of wildfire, and it has very unique properties, physical and chemical properties, and so it influences the chemical environment in soils, in pyrogenic ecosystems. And so therefore, we might think of it as a substrate legacy that organisms have evolved to over time. And so I'll just give you guys I'll just sort of give you some background into what charcoal does. This is a scanning electron micrograph of a piece of wood charcoal. And it's almost pure carbon, has very low oxygen to hydrogen ratios. And it has very high surface area. But it's been overlooked for a long time. For up until about 15 years ago, charcoal in natural ecosystems was overlooked because it was believed to be inert. Meaning that because it has very low cation exchange capacity, it doesn't bond with ionic substances in the soil. Okay, so soil fertility is thought to be related to cation exchange capacity, which it is. But what it does have with this high surface area has non-polar bonding surfaces. Okay, so you can have polar and non-polar bonding. Polar bonding is plus minus attractions. Non-polar bonding are organic functional groups attractions. Okay, and that's what a lot of the chemistry going on in soils is in that organic fraction, dissolved organic carbon, dissolved organic nitrogen, and microbial processes, enzymes and the like, are in the organic fraction, or so therefore are probably going to be affected, or the hypothesis is that they're going to be affected by the presence or absence of charcoal in the environment. And as you can see in a fire environment, there's a lot of it. All of this blackened material on the boles of the trees eventually sloughs off the tree and is deposited into the soil surface, and over time works into the soil profile to depth as well. Okay, and so in places like Australia, they've found charcoal to 4 meters depth in the soil. Okay, and I'll show you some data about how much charcoal we have in different North American ecosystems. So basically, we can look at how does charcoal specifically affect nitrification and ammonium oxidizing bacteria. Okay, so how does charcoal in natural ecosystems, how does charcoal affect microorganisms? Okay, and so the first graph is, and so what we did was these are some sites in Montana that were wilderness area sites, hadn't burned, or they'd either burned 0 times in the last 100 years or 3 times in the last 100 years, which is more reminiscent of the natural fire return interval. And the sites that burned more frequently had more nitrate, more gross nitrification, more ammonium oxidizing bacteria, and also had more charcoal quantity in those soils. Okay, so that's evidence that charcoal is having a direct effect on these ecosystem properties. We further sort of looked at the rhizosphere chemistry and tried to determine a little bit about how charcoal was mediating that effect. And so we looked at the rhizosphere of 2 different plant communities in fire-excluded soils. And we inoculated them with glycine, so an organic nitrogen source, and charcoal. And what we found was that, so the 2 different mesocosm types were shrub. So this is an ericaceous shrub community versus a sedge community. And so what we did, and with charcoal is in black and no charcoal in gray. So with charcoal in the shrubs, stimulated nitrification. But it didn't have any effect on the sedge community. And what we sort of thought about that was that the sedges are already adapted to a fast nitrogen cycle, and they don't try to tie up nitrogen in organic forms, whereas the shrub community is a slow nitrogen cycle, woody, long-lived species, probably is trying to tie up organic nitrogen in these recalcitrant compounds, and that's sort of what charcoal is, or how charcoal is affecting that relationship, is that it absorbs up phenols. And so what we did was, in the lab, we took charcoal, we took litter from both the shrub from the shrub community. We took leaf litter from the shrubs, and we did a hot water extraction of that material, and then we shook it overnight with about 1% charcoal in solution. And essentially what it did is, and then we measured total phenols. And so these phenolic compounds are sort of a precursor for humus formation, or basically a precursor for recalcitrant organic material. And in the absence of charcoal, so just in the leaf litter extract, there was, so this is times 10, 450 parts per million of phenols. And after shaking overnight with charcoal, we're down to about 25 parts per million of phenols. And so that's sort of some more evidence showing that charcoal mediates that chemical environment, but that it's different in that chemical environment in the rhizosphere, but it's different for different types of organisms. So that brings me to the next idea, which is, can biochar be used as a surrogate for fire in reclamation? And so biochar is basically a man-made substrate that is very much like charcoal. Biochar, you can make biochar out of any organic substrate by heating it in the absence of oxygen. So under controlled conditions with heat and low oxygen, you basically carbonize organic material and make it into something very much like charcoal. So you can see this is the black carbon gradient, and is on the x-axis, this is basically increasing heat over time. And so you have raw organic matter, which basically over time turns into charcoal, which is a combustion residue, or it can be soot, which is a combustion condensate. So it means it's entered the gas phase and recondensed out as soot. And so my thinking is that biochar, this man-made product, is a surrogate for wildfire. However, soot, so if you remember back to some of those difficult substrates in oil sands reclamation or in oil sands processing, petroleum coke is a soot product. Okay? It's the same as soot. And so they already have a waste stream that might be used for reclamation as a surrogate for fire. And that's sort of what I'm hoping to do in the future, is to conduct research examining this. What I have today are some preliminary incubation results to show you about how biochar mediates soil processes in these different reclamation substrate types. Okay, so we just did this It's an incubation experiment in these mesocosm chambers. So basically what we do is we build a little mini soil profile in here with the addition of different substrates. And then we incubate this was incubated for 300 days. And periodically over the incubation period, we extract nitrogen samples. So we're looking at cumulative nitrogen mineralization over time. And what we did was we added biochar, and I also added black carbon, which is a coke product. And I'm not going to show you the coke results today, but I will show you the biochar results. And again, we use these oil sand reclamation substrates, peat mineral mix, forest floor mineral mix, and a combination of those two things. And then by producing this mineralization over time, what we can do is we can use nonlinear regression analysis and first order kinetics to calculate sort of the amount of end mineralization and the kinetic rate or rate constant of kinetics and this sort of total labile pool. And what I'm going to show you today are these graphs, but I'm just going to report the R-squared value for right now. So essentially, all of these graphs for the next two slides have days on the bottom axis, so up to 300 days, and then they have total inorganic nitrogen on the y-axis, and this is cumulative over time. So each measurement period I add to the next measurement period. And what you can see then is we have peat mineral mix, forest floor, and the mixture, okay? And basically the pattern of end mineralization for peat mineral mix does not fit first order kinetics. Okay, you can see if you just look at the points here are the measured data, and the blue line is the modeled data. Okay, and what you can see is just that the points don't fit very well in peat mineral mix. The points don't fit. The measured points don't fit the modeled data very well. And the R squared here is 0.81, okay, or 81% explanation by that model. Still high, but not a very good fit. If we look at the forest floor mineral mix, it right off the bat fits first order kinetics properly, and it has an R squared of 97%. Okay, and the mix is sort of somewhere in between. And so what this suggests to me is that forest floor. So this first order decomposition kinetics is based on aerobic substrates, and to me this just is sort of evidence that this substrate that formed in anaerobic conditions is in an aerobic environment has strange decomposition properties. Okay. So, but if I add biochar to this, biochar makes end mineralization a better fit to first order kinetics for the peat mineral. So if I add biochar, so this is the same exact experiment, except now the peat mineral mix has 5% biochar addition to it, 99% explanation, right? It's shocking. And the forest floor sort of went, it's still a nonlinear curve, but it's sort of the pattern of the curve changed a lot, but it's still a very good fit. And it's sort of interesting. And then again, the mix is kind of in between. But there's a couple things to note from this. And the first one is, or there's a couple take-home messages. The first one is that there is a reduction, though, in the amount of nitrogen. Okay, so if you look at the peat mineral mix here without charcoal, we have about 160 milligrams per kilogram after 300 days. But if we look with charcoal, we'll only have about 100 milligrams per kilogram, right? So there's a significant reduction in the amount of nitrogen available over time. But that might not be a bad thing on this heavily disturbed site, right? I'll come back to that idea later on. The other thing to note is that, the take-home message is that this might be, or I guess related to that, is that this might be making the substrate with charcoal into more of a slow-release fertilizer condition, right? That this material would be released slowly for plant uptake over time. Okay, how am I doing for time? Okay. The other thing that I wanted to talk to you guys about today is the idea of space. How can we use space as a different way of looking at ecosystem development over time? And so the idea about space is that everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related to each other than far things, right? It's Tobler's first law of geography, right? So it's not often we get to cite laws in ecology, right? But basically what that means is that we have all of these key variables here, right? Plant productivity, nutrient fluxes, microbial diversity, organic matter quality. But you could argue that measuring, for example, nutrient availability, and I argue this all the time, it's not that meaningful. If we just measure the amount of available nitrogen season after season, it doesn't tell us very much, because I would argue that we don't actually know what is the nitrogen requirements for wild or for native plant species, So for sure in agriculture, we know what nitrogen requirements are because we study one crop at a time in one location, and we add fertilizer and we watch if there's more or less yield. Okay? And so that species is only competing against itself or other individuals of the same species, whereas in a natural ecosystem, you have potentially hundreds of species all competing with each other, all with different sort of life history strategies, competing for the same resources. So I'm not sure that the available nitrogen or the amount of nitrogen is a useful parameter for determining reclamation success. But I would argue that all of these things are encompassed within this spatial relationship. Okay, so that everything in an ecosystem is related to everything else by some spatial component that you can tease apart with statistics. And so what we can do with geostatistics is two things. We can look at patches. We can just look at the size of patches for different ecosystem properties, such as nitrogen availability. And we can sort of think that there could be large and small scale heterogeneity. And what we need to do is sort of measure what is the heterogeneity in natural sites versus what we're building it on reclaimed sites. And so just for some aerial photos, just for some visualization, in an agricultural system, you would expect these to be very large patches or a large amount of uniformity. Right? And I think that that's what we're doing in land reclamations. We're building these very large, uniform environments. But we know that our natural forests, just from looking at these sort of aerial views, have a lot of fine-scale spatial heterogeneity related to a lot of different features, structural components, location of different types of species of plants, and that sort of stuff. The other thing that we can do with space is we can use space as a surrogate for unmeasured variables. And we can do that by taking the spatially explicit XY coordinates of our sample locations. And so let's say we measure distance to tree, and we want to know the effect of organic matter accumulation with distance to tree. But we didn't measure topography. Let's say topography was pretty subtle on the site, so we kind of left it out. Well, you would expect, though, we know that at a lower slope position, there's probably going to be an accumulation of organic matter. But spatial statistics would allow us to remove that spatial residual effect, so that in a spatial ANOVA environment, all we're looking at is the effect of distance to tree. So it's a different way of thinking about statistics and ecosystem processes. So space here in this case could be a surrogate for topography. So we're just going to run through really quickly because I'm running out of time. We're running through a couple examples. So this is looking at the spatial distribution in some different ecosystems in California. And we looked at the amount of charcoal and its potential spatial effect on total carbon and total nitrogen. And if we just look at the amount of charcoal, I think this is really interesting. We have amount of charcoal on the x-axis. And so in these forested ecosystems in California, we have between about 2,000 and 5,000 kilograms per hectare of charcoal just in the top 5 centimeters of soil. Okay, so it's a significant fraction of the organic carbon in soils. And there's research from Saskatchewan, from prairies, that suggests that charcoal can be up to 45% of the total carbon signature in prairie soil. So it's an important substrate that we need to examine further. And it has some spatial patchiness associated with it too. So down on the very bottom, if you just focus on that one, this is an autocorrelation. Moran's eye is an autocorrelation. So how similar is any one sample? How similar is it to a sample close to it versus far away from it? And what it shows us is sort of the size of patches. So what this is suggesting is that there's sort of a patch size at this fine spatial pattern of about 3 or 4 meters. Our patches are more similar to each other. So it's positive autocorrelation. So about 3 meter size patches more similar to each other. And then when you get out to about 20 meters away from any individual site, then you get sort of negative autocorrelation, so more different from each other. Okay? So that's indicating that charcoal has a fine scale pattern on all of these sites. A little bit different in this mixed conifer one, and then this is red fir. Okay, so it has a patchiness to it. And then it also, if we look at the relationship between total carbon and total nitrogen to charcoal, so this is an ANOVA analysis after the spatial residuals have been removed. Okay, so we're taking out the effect of all of the things that we didn't measure. And what we're finding here is that charcoal still has a 10 to 20% effect on mineral soil, total carbon, and total nitrogen. Okay, so it has a significant effect on biogeochemical parameters as well. We can apply this stuff to land reclamation. So this is work that Preston Sorensen did, where he did this on a couple different reclaim sites that are about 25 years since reclamation. So this is just sort of an idea of, the red are his sampling locations and the black are all of the trees he measured. So it's a lot of work in the field, right? It's your spatially explicit samples for every tree in about a 1/4 hectare area. And the red are where he took soil samples from. And this is the kind of work that Fang Lang does, where he looks at 300,000 trees in tropical environments, right? It's massive work. But what Preston sort of found is, I'll just go through this quickly, is that 25 years after reclamation, there's a difference in canopy cover between aspen and pine, sort of different canopy cover patches, which may be related to nitrogen availability. So in the fall, nitrogen had a similar patch, suggesting that it was maybe related to canopy dynamics. But in the spring and summer, it had a very different patch size. And I don't think anyone in the literature has looked at the seasonal variability of patch size, right? So if you think about this, it means that these patches are sort of like expanding and contracting seasonally, is what it would suggest. And I don't know if I can explain that or not, right? So it needs more work. And it's sort of slightly different in the pine system. And then he also looked at spatial anova, and what he found was that there are significant relationships with distance to tree, which at the farther away from a tree you got, actual more nitrogen availability in soils there was, right? So that makes sense. Trees are taking up nitrogen. The canopy had an effect on nitrogen, sulfur, and calcium. The forest floor itself had an effect on phosphorus, potassium, and calcium. But then there was a seasonal effect too. So season had an effect on phosphorus and sulfur. And then there was this intercept term. And the intercept term represents a spatial residual. So now what it's suggesting is that this model didn't accurately describe the pattern of phosphorus and sulfur. So something else is spatially working on that. And Sonaton has gone ahead and done some more work on that stuff and has found that it's the microbial community is driving phosphorus and sulfur dynamics a little bit more. Okay, so summarize. I think that disturbance causes changes in ecosystem process. I think we can all agree on that. Nitrogen availability, large spike after fire and reclamation, but are they different? Are they too different, right? So I think the question we need to answer is the magnitude of one or the other really different? In land reclamation, is it much higher than in fire for much longer? Plant microbial communities change over time, but I think we need to answer the question, is it too weedy? In these sort of high fertility reclaimed environments, is the plant community that's coming back, is it too weedy? And how can we change that? And so one way to change that might be to recognize that charcoal is an important substrate for rhizosphere biogeochemistry, and is this idea of a substrate legacy. So maybe we should be putting it back into the reclaimed environment because organisms are adapted to this substrate type. And so therefore, biochar is a surrogate for some of the effects of fire. So does it have a use in land reclamation? I think it does. And what if it has a negative effect on plant growth, though? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Like, are we okay with the fact that it's going to reduce nitrogen availability and that may reduce productivity, but a lichen pine ecosystem is not a very productive ecosystem to begin with? Should we be trying to maximize productivity? Is that the right answer? And I guess you could also argue that by reducing nitrogen availability, you might change it from a weedy community to a more native community. And then the last thing, space is a parameter to track ecosystem development. I think it's a really interesting one that needs more work because these sort of criteria and bioindicators that have a value, like salinity, I can tell you over a certain salinity that's too much. But nitrogen, I can't tell you that. And so I think that maybe spatial parameters are going to be a better way of tracking ecosystem development. And then that we can sort of increase heterogeneity in land reclamation. Because I would argue that we're creating these sort of uniform environments, and maybe right off the bat when these reclamation environments are built, we should be adding heterogeneity. Some ways of doing that might be using patchy soil placement, like forest floor mineral material in patches, because we don't have enough of it to use continuously, so why not be more discriminatory with it? Patchy biochar placement would be another one. Coarse woody debris, that's already being researched by people like Ann Nathan in the department. And then maybe planting more diverse understory communities as well. But that might be too costly, but maybe we need to go there. Maybe we need to investigate that some more.